I always believed that true love was forged in the fires of shared struggle. Richard and I had weathered storms that would have sunk other marriages: layoffs, credit card debt, family drama that left us both feeling worn out and small. But even in those late-night conversations, counting every last penny, I never doubted we'd find our way through. I held on to the hope that every setback was just one more step toward the future we promised each other. Our little kitchen became a safe haven for our whispered dreams, mugs of tea warming our hands as we sketched out the life we wanted. Richard would talk about his vision for the tech world, his eyes bright with possibility. Every time he spoke of breakthroughs and new ideas, it felt like the world cracked open just a little bit wider. I couldn't help but feel proud of him, of us. Of course I had my own dreams, the ones I tucked away for later, thinking there'd be time for me too. But when I watched Richard chase after his ambitions, so full of life and purpose, it felt like we were both reaching for something bigger than ourselves. Maybe that's what love really was, lifting someone up so high they touched the sky. I remember the quiet nights most of all, the ones where the world felt heavy, but somehow being together made it all feel lighter. We'd sit at the kitchen table long after dinner was done, our plates pushed to the side, just talking about the life we wanted. Richard would take my hand and say, "When it happens, we'll celebrate in style." And I'd believe him, because every time he said it, his eyes shone with that fire I fell in love with. Sometimes I'd catch myself imagining what those celebrations might look like. Maybe we'd toast champagne in some fancy restaurant, or maybe we'd just dance barefoot in the living room, music turned up loud and laughter spilling out like wine. I didn't care about the details. What mattered was that we'd made it through, together. Even on the nights when money was tight and the future felt impossibly far away, I held on to that belief. Our love had always been our anchor, a steady force when everything else felt like it might slip away. I thought that if we could just keep holding on to each other, we'd find a way to make it all real. I think what kept me going all those years was the way we balanced each other out. Richard was the dreamer, always chasing the next big idea, while I was the steady hand, the one who made sure the bills got paid and the fridge stayed full. It was a dance we'd perfected without even realizing it, and I wore that role like a badge of honor. I believed in his dreams as if they were my own. Sometimes, late at night, I'd feel the weight of the sacrifices I'd made, the career opportunities I'd turned down, the passions I'd put on hold. But then I'd see the way Richard looked at me when he talked about his plans, and it was enough. I told myself that someday, when he finally reached that finish line, we'd share the victory together. There was a quiet kind of comfort in those thoughts, a belief that love wasn't just about big, showy gestures, but about showing up for each other when it mattered most. I knew that if we could survive those endless nights of uncertainty, we could handle anything the world threw at us. And in those small shared moments, I never imagined how quickly everything would change. I'll never forget the morning Richard walked through the door with that look in his eyes. He'd been called into a last-minute meeting at work, and when he came home, he just stood there for a moment, his shoulders squared, his whole face lit up with something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Emma," he said, and his voice was shaking a little. "They've made me CEO." The words hung in the air like confetti. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest as I threw my arms around him. After all the late nights and the endless worries, it felt like we'd finally arrived at that shimmering moment we'd always talked about. I could almost taste the relief on my lips, the sense that every single sacrifice had been worth it. I remember laughing through tears, the two of us caught in that sweet, dizzying moment of victory. It was like the air had shifted around us, everything suddenly bright and full of promise. I thought of all those nights at the kitchen table, all the whispered plans and shared fears, and it felt like every piece had finally clicked into place. The next few days felt like a whirlwind, phone calls, handshakes, and congratulations pouring in from every corner of Richard's world. I watched him move through it all with this new confidence, shoulders back, chin lifted. I'd never seen him so alive, so sure of himself. I couldn't help but feel proud, like we'd both crossed some invisible finish line together. I busied myself with plans for a special dinner, something to mark this milestone in our lives. I wanted it to be a night to remember. candles, his favorite dishes, and that bottle of wine we'd been saving for a night just like this. I kept picturing us sitting there, hands intertwined across the table, laughing about how far we'd come. I imagined the soft glow of candlelight on his face, the way he'd look at me and say, "We made it, Em." And in those moments, I felt this warm glow in my chest, a quiet kind of joy that seemed to settle in my bones. I told myself that this was what it had all been for. Every penny pinched, every dream deferred. We'd made it through the worst of it, and now we could finally breathe easy, together. But as the days went on, I started to notice little changes. Richard was always on the phone, caught up in endless meetings and strategy sessions that pulled him away from home. He'd come back late, his mind somewhere else, eyes distant even when he was right in front of me. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself he was just adjusting to the weight of this new role, the responsibility pressing down on him like a heavy crown. I tried to keep the faith, telling myself that the man who once held my dreams so close to his heart was still in there somewhere. I'd set the table and wait for him to come home, rehearse the things I wanted to say about how proud I was. But every time he walked through that door, it felt like he was a little further away, a little harder to reach. I'd smile and ask how his day was, and he'd give me a half answer, already scrolling through his phone for the next meeting. Still, I held on to the belief that this was just a phase, that once the dust settled, we'd find each other again. I thought, maybe if I just gave him time, he'd remember those nights at the kitchen table, the promises we'd made in the dark. I didn't know then how close we were to a moment that would shatter everything. I spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen, pouring my heart into every little detail of that dinner. I wanted it to be special, a celebration of everything we'd been through and everything that lay ahead. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, the table set with our best dishes, candles flickering softly like tiny promises. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, my heart swelling with the hope that tonight would be the night we finally exhaled. When Richard came through the door, I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. I greeted him with a smile, ready to share this small piece of joy I'd created. But the look on his face stopped me cold. He barely glanced at the table, his eyes darting around like he couldn't be bothered to see what I'd done. My words of welcome fell flat, swallowed by the silence that stretched out between us like a chasm. I tried to keep my voice steady, telling him how proud I was, how much I'd been looking forward to this moment. But before I could finish, he cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand, like I was just another meeting on his calendar. In that instant, the warmth I'd spent all day building vanished, replaced by something colder than I'd ever known. His words felt like a slap I never saw coming. He looked at me, his face blank and distant, and said, "Now that I've made it, I need someone who's at my level." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I must have misheard. I searched his face for a sign that he was joking, that this was just some cruel misunderstanding. But there was nothing there, no warmth, no regret, just cold certainty. I felt the room spin around me, the candles flickering in the draft of his indifference. My hands went numb, the carefully prepared meal turning to ash in my mouth. Every word I'd wanted to say, every expression of pride, every whispered dream of a shared future, turned to dust in the space between us. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. My heart felt like it was cracking open, raw and exposed. He didn't even seem to notice the pain etched across my face. He just turned away, already moving on to something else, as if I were nothing more than a footnote in his story. In that moment, I realized he hadn't just left me behind. He'd erased me entirely, like I was nothing more than an obstacle he'd finally outgrown. I stood there for a long moment, frozen in the soft glow of candlelight that suddenly felt too bright, too hopeful. My hands trembled as I reached for a chair, needing something to hold on to. The silence between us was deafening, a roar of everything that had just been lost. I kept waiting for him to take it back, to realize what he'd said and how deeply it had cut. But he didn't. He just turned his back and walked away, leaving me alone in a room that still smelled of rosemary and ruin. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in my throat like shards of glass. All I could think about was how many times I'd given up pieces of myself for him, how I'd believed that love meant sacrifice. In that instant, I saw the truth as clearly as the flicker of those dying candles. He didn't see me at all. I was just another chapter he was ready to close. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't let his cruelty define me. The pain was real, sharp as a knife, but beneath it, there was something else. A quiet resolve beginning to take root. And as the echoes of his words faded, I felt a small spark deep inside me, something that told me this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, I felt like I was moving through a fog, every breath heavy, every step uncertain. The house we'd shared felt like a museum of our old life, echoes of laughter and whispered promises lingering in every corner. I couldn't bear to sit at that kitchen table, so I took long walks instead, my thoughts churning like storm clouds. I knew I had to find a way to move forward, but the path felt as fragile as glass under my feet. I leaned hard on the people who still saw me, who reminded me that I was more than the pieces he'd left behind. My friends became my lifeline, wrapping me in warmth when I felt cold and hollow inside. My family offered steady hands and quiet understanding, their belief in me a balm to the ache in my chest. Slowly, I started to see that the love I'd given him wasn't wasted. It had made me strong, even if he couldn't see it. In the quiet moments, I began to remember the dreams I'd buried for so long. They came back to me in flashes, the things I used to love, the small joys that once lit up my world. I let myself feel them again, like tiny sparks in the dark, each one a promise that I was still here, that I was still whole, even if he couldn't see it. It wasn't easy, learning to stand on my own again. There were days when I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back at me, her eyes red from crying, but her chin lifted just a little higher each time. I started to take small steps, signing up for classes I'd always wanted to try, picking up books that had been gathering dust on the shelf. Every new experience felt like a tiny act of rebellion, a way to reclaim pieces of myself I'd given away too freely. I found comfort in the things I used to love, those simple pleasures that made my heart beat a little faster. I'd lose myself in a good book for hours, or spend an afternoon wandering through art galleries, letting color and light remind me that beauty still existed, even in the midst of all this pain. I started cooking just for me, filling the kitchen with new smells and flavors that felt like tiny triumphs. Each day, I felt the weight of his betrayal a little less. I knew the pain wouldn't vanish overnight, but I also knew that it didn't have to define me. With every choice I made for myself, I felt a little stronger, a little closer to the woman I wanted to be. And deep down, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved more than the scraps he'd left behind. I realized one morning, while sipping coffee in the early light, that my life was my own again, and that was a kind of freedom I'd almost forgotten how to cherish. There was power in the small choices, the music I played as I got ready for the day, the way I arranged fresh flowers in a vase just because it made me smile. It was in the quiet hours when I let my mind wander, no longer bound by his expectations or his silent judgments. I started to see how much of myself I'd set aside for him, and I made a quiet vow not to do that again. There were still shadows of what had been, memories that would sneak up on me in the quiet of the night. But instead of letting them drag me back, I let them remind me of how far I'd come. Every tear I'd shed, every night I'd spent alone. They were proof that I'd survived, and that I was stronger for it. As the days turned into weeks, I could feel my heart mending, piece by fragile piece. I wasn't the same woman who had once waited by the door for his return. I was someone who had learned to trust her own voice again. And as I looked ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe the best parts of my story were still waiting for me to write them. Months passed, and with each sunrise, I found myself growing into someone I hadn't been in years, someone who didn't just survive, but thrived. I started to build a life that felt like mine again, piece by piece, moment by moment. My mornings were no longer filled with worry about what he'd think or whether I was enough for him. Instead, they were full of plans that had nothing to do with his ambitions and everything to do with mine. I poured my energy into things that lit me up, classes that challenged me, work that made me feel proud, and friendships that felt like deep, nourishing roots. I stopped asking permission to be myself. I realized that the only approval I ever really needed was my own, and that truth was more liberating than any promise he'd ever made me. For the first time in so long, I felt the weight of the past slip from my shoulders like an old coat I'd finally outgrown. And when I looked at my reflection now, I saw a woman who had been broken and rebuilt herself. My eyes no longer carried the sadness of what was lost. They shone with the quiet strength of someone who had faced the worst and come out braver. I no longer felt the need to chase after the love of someone who didn't see me. I was finally learning what it meant to love myself, and that felt like the most important triumph of all. One evening, I found myself at an industry event, the kind of gathering that once would have made me feel small and out of place. But this time, I walked in with my head high and my heart steady. I wore a dress that made me feel like I could conquer the world, and I let every conversation be a chance to share the person I'd become. I wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. I was there for me. And then, almost like fate was testing my resolve, I saw him. Richard. He was surrounded by people who laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word, but when his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe surprise, maybe regret. For a moment, I let myself feel the echo of the woman I'd been, the one who would have given anything for his attention. But then I remembered how far I'd come, and I just smiled. I didn't need to say a word. My presence was enough. In that moment, I realized I wasn't there to impress him or to show him what he'd lost. I was there to show myself how much I'd gained, how much more vibrant and alive my life had become without him in it. And as I turned away from him, I felt a quiet surge of pride that no one could ever take from me. I left the event that night with a smile on my face and a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. The city lights shimmered around me as I walked back to my car, each step a quiet celebration of the woman I'd become. I thought about all the nights I'd spent waiting for someone else to choose me, to see me, and how now I finally chose myself. There was no fanfare, no grand declaration of victory, just a simple, unwavering truth. I was enough, more than enough. The life I was building wasn't about him or anyone else. It was about me and what I wanted, and who I was when no one was watching. And that was worth more than any empty promise or fleeting validation he could have given me. As I drove home, I felt a calm settle over me. My story wasn't defined by what he did or didn't do. It was mine to write, mine to live. And in that quiet moment, I realized that the future stretched out in front of me like a canvas, blank, beautiful, and entirely my own.